Folks, you know the only thing better than week 1 of the Big Ten college football season? Week 2, of course. And Ken Davis and I are here to talk about all of that. A lot of really, honestly, fascinating matchups in the conference this weekend, including our first set of in-conference games already. Yes, that's right. You've got Maryland and Michigan State going at it. That is going to be the first Big Ten game of the season. Before we get to all of that stuff, though, how you doing today, Mr. Davis?
I'm doing well, James. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, man. Doing good. It's a beautiful sunny day. Got the windows open. Like, it feels like fall. You can see I've got some fall decoration in the house. The wife got a little busy yesterday trying to force summer out the door. And as much as I dispute it, it's hard to say that it's not coming. Like I said, windows open, all that stuff. So anyway, enough of my childish obsession with wanting to hold on to summer as long as we can. Let's talk some football, Mr. Davis. And there are a few games that we want to get to. We're going to get into in a lot of detail. We're going to have guests on to talk about those games. That includes the rematch of Colorado and Nebraska, which you will see on Saturday night. And then you also have a really titanic showdown of two top 10 teams. As number 3, Texas, comes to the Big House to take on Michigan. But before we get to all of those games with our special guest today, Ken, we figured there were a couple other games that were worthy of our attention. I think we'll start with the Cy-Hawk Trophy game, which will take place at Kinnick Stadium at Iowa as they welcome their in-state rivals, Iowa State. Ken, I got to say, there's two things about this. One, I, of course, want to see if Iowa's offense is going to be able to do what they did last week. The second thing, they're only favored by 2.5 points at home over the Cyclones. Am I insane, or is that like a sucker bet? Because I want to pound that line in favor of Iowa. What are you kind of thinking as you look at that particular matchup?
I think it's a sucker bet, but I also think there's some sound reasoning behind it. Like, I would take the bet. I don't gamble that often. I know you and Alex are behind the lines making coin and excluding Tony and myself out of it, so shame on both of you. But I think it's one of those things when you're talking about an in-state rivalry is part of the issue. But I also think you hit on, and you do this often, it's the hesitancy in knowing what the offense is going to be. You know, when you see that against a lesser opponent, now you want to see if they can do that against someone that knows them and knows what they like to do. You hold back when you're setting those odds because you never know, and usually it's going to be a tight game. But I think 2 points. I think with Cade being healthy this year, we're seeing somewhat. I think they can at least win perhaps by a field goal at least. So I would probably put some money on that. But again, it's one of those things where rivalry games, we could take the in-state aspect out, even though you can add that too, because it made me think about it. I'm not saying this rivalry is on the same level, but Duke and Carolina, and of course, they're in the same state. They're both on Tobacco Road. And it doesn't matter if one team is down and the other team is contending for a national championship that season. They usually split and one or kick the crap out of each other. So I think that's a large part of the reason why that spread is set at 2.
Yeah, and most of the games in the recent past have been fairly close. I think the biggest difference in points that's happened the last few seasons, I think Iowa won by 10 points, I want to say, in one of the games. And then there was one year where Iowa just mercilessly beat the tar out of Iowa State. That was 2016. I just looked that one up. But these games do historically play close. And we have mentioned before, we mentioned during our last podcast that Iowa looked honestly really good in the second half against Illinois State. It did take their offense a little while to kind of get going against the Redbirds, but I do have to say, I was not that impressed with how Iowa State handled North Dakota. Like, yeah, they only allowed 3 points, but they allowed decent yardage in that game. Their offense didn't look particularly good. I think we could see a little bit more of a defensive kind of struggle in this game, just kind of based on the way that Iowa and Iowa State kind of handle their business. But I have to say, with the way Iowa's offense played last week, it does make me wonder a little bit if they're perhaps more capable of winning by more than a field goal, by like 7, by 10 points. And if that's the case, then a 2.5 point spread just really isn't indicative, I don't think, of what Iowa is capable of doing, especially at home at Kinnick Stadium. I feel like that. I mean, you've said this on the podcast in the past, and I completely agree with it, that home field has to be worth at least 2 or 3 points in these games. The fact they basically think it's an even split, I mean, Vegas knows what they're talking about, but this feels like an instance where I'm like, maybe Iowa should be getting a little bit more love on the betting lines.
even look, let's and again, they have to improve offensively, but let's just take that out of it, right? You're not talking about two offensive juggernauts whatsoever, but you're talking about, and I'm talking about Iowa and Iowa State right here. You're talking about one of the best defenses and one of the better special teams. So that alone, I would think, James, is 2 field goals. Just to be, if we just slow everything down, and let's just say Iowa's offense is decent, not even good, it's decent. All right, they're able to score a touchdown, all right, and maybe a field goal, and of course, that's special teams too. But I'm saying outside of that, I think they could perhaps score another field goal, if not not another 2 field goals. So for me, I'm with you. I think 10 points wouldn't be crazy. I also think Kirk Ferentz has something to prove. But sooner or later, and again, I know he could stay there until he's rolling around in the dirt, and I'm not trying to put him in the ground whatsoever. But sooner or later, you're gonna have to do more. Like. You do. And you're getting to that point. They ran your son out of there to where you're going to have to show improve. You talk to a lot of Iowa alums, and they're not happy. Like you talked to Iowa alums like a decade ago, and they kind of wasn't happy, but they still had their chest out. You talk to Iowa alums now, they're just not happy, and the chest part is not even there.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that there is a lot of prove it to Iowa's schedule this season, and they are going to have kind of limited opportunities to do that because we've talked about their schedule not being as strong as some of the other teams in the Big Ten. When it comes to the Big Ten standings, everything will kind of take care of itself. But when you're talking about potential at-large bids for the college football playoff, these are the types of games that ultimately matter, and you want to make a statement against an in-state rival. We've seen so many times, like in Alabama-Auburn, for instance, when Alabama is so clearly the better team that they end up playing really tight against Auburn. They need a 4th and 31 to convert to win and to punch a ticket to a championship game. Like those are the types of things that happen in these in-state rivalry games. But I just look at the way that Iowa's defense also played last week against Illinois State. You had an incredibly potent pass rush last week. Aaron Graves had 3 sacks for Iowa last week. You had Brian Allen, who had a sack last week. They had a lot of hurries against Illinois State. I thought their linebackers looked really good in that game. They were really covering gaps well, doing a lot of the little things right. Basically anything that you would assume that Iowa's defense would do, they were doing in that game. And again, I know it was Illinois State. The fact is they shut them out, really limited that offense. And then the fact that they were able to score points on offense, Iowa was, that's a really good sign to me of things moving forward. And again, I just feel like this is a game where they have an opportunity to not just go in and potentially beat Iowa State. They have an opportunity to really make a statement and really show this is a different Iowa team than what we've seen in recent years.
Okay. Everything you said, I kind of heard. 2 points right here. You just pointed out everything they did defensively, and we haven't even talked about the fact that they may be able to score defensively. But let's not say they can score defensively. Let's say there's no pick six. You can still flip the field. I just think it's really advantageous for Iowa to send a message like you say, but I just think 2.5 is too low, James. I see something close to 6 or 7 points. Yeah. We've talked profusely on here about that Iowa defense is one of the best in the country. So I don't think Iowa State really has a chance, if I'm just being honest with you. But anybody that can't watch us and is listening to us, I just want to point out just how great this gentleman is at his job. He has several cats, him and his wife. And the cat jumped in his lap. You wouldn't know if you weren't watching this because he didn't pause. He didn't hesitate. He rubbed the cat and then after a second put the cat down, but still maintaining everything that he was saying. And the cat caught me, James. I lost my focus for a second, so I applaud you for not using yours.
What's really funny is I noticed you noticed, and I was like, Ken's going to say something about that. Like, Critter wanted to make sure that he got into the, picture. It's a day late, but happy National Ginger Cat Day. That was apparently recent. So Critter just wanted to observe it by being on a podcast, and I respect him for it. So, yeah, I think that you and I are just we're hitting similar notes here, I think, with this game, that we think that Iowa should perhaps be favored by a little bit more than they are. So I think, Ken, do you want to just be comfortable and say we're both picking Iowa to not just win this game, but also to cover that spread? Okay. Yes. I'm writing that down. By the way, do want to point out last week, for those of you who did not know, Ken went 3-1-1 in his picks last week. I went 2-2-1. So Ken is 1-0 on the season on this podcast, defeating me in the bets. Good job, Ken. We will continue on with our look at the Big Ten schedule, like I said, quite a few games that I think are ultimately going to be interesting, especially with some of the rivalry games from last season that, had kind of been played. And now you've got the shoe on the other foot kind of situation. One that's, I think, going to fly a little bit under the radar and perhaps shouldn't is Boise State in Oregon. Now, I think we talked about Oregon a little bit on the last episode where they did not necessarily look great. They did not look like they were at full power. They had over 500 yards of offense. Their defense really didn't play that poorly, but they were just in that game against Idaho for a lot longer than I think you and I thought. I think they need to clean things up quite a bit, honestly. There were a lot of really bad. I think I saw somewhere it was 7 of their 8 penalties were on their offensive line during that game. You can't keep drawing yourself back 5-10 yards with false starts and holding penalties. And I think that Oregon just kind of continually shot themselves in the foot last week. And I want to say that's something they, of course, desperately need to clean up. But on the other token, they also, their defense had a modestly good game last week. They're going up against an offense in Boise State that put up 551 yards of offense against Georgia Southern last week. And all Ashton Genty did was rush for 267 yards and 6 touchdowns. So they're favored by 19 points in this game against Boise State out Autzen Stadium. I expect a lot better effort, a lot cleaner effort out of Oregon. I got to think that game's going to be a little bit closer than that. What were your thoughts kind of looking at this game, Ken?
You know what? It's funny when you say that. I think Oregon has something to prove. Also, our resident Oregon alum, Bears insider Josh Schrock, as you've mentioned it last week, is asking when is he's coming on. We had a text this morning talking about that offensive line. Their right guard they spent their money on being out, and they had to move their center to guard. So that's been an issue. We didn't see the run game that we expected. And it's funny when you're talking about Boise running like it's the 80s or the 70s or the 60s or the 30s or whatever. When football was just about rushing the football. When your running back is up 200 and something yards, we don't see that. The 90s too. We don't see that. Those Ron Dane, those crazy numbers that we've seen here in the Big Ten from rushers just taking over. I think Oregon has something. You know what? I'll say this for you about it. I wouldn't want to be the team that Oregon faces after coming out and not looking as desirable as a top 3 team in the country. You know? So there were some questions, but it's early in the season, and I think that's something that you and I kind of temper everything with, because it's easy to fly off the handle and say, well, look, they're not this and they're not that. We know Oregon has a vast amount of talent. There's still going to be, and again, this isn't in Big Ten, but there's still going to be some changes. But also, we talked about this. They've never beaten Boise State. For me, I think we both admit that this is a victory for Oregon. 19 points is a lot. 19 points is telling me that we're talking about last year's team, and I don't necessarily know if Dylan Gabriel is, at this point, not to say he can't get there, Bo Nix. I don't know if this offense is going to fly that way, because even with almost having 50 attempts, they still didn't blow out a team. Like, you would think with playing a lesser team that if they had to lean on their passing game, they would have just exploited that other team's defense. You know what I'm saying? And we didn't see that. But again, it's at the beginning of the year, and sometimes great teams, and I still will say that there definitely we should include them in the great teams. We have to see if they're going to be a great team. But great teams have clunkers too, Yes. And the thing is, when you have a clunker, to still succeed and win, and compared to having a clunker and this is more of the past than today, but it knocks you out of the national championship, because that loss back when there was no playoff was a lot more significant than what one loss could be right now. But I think I have no problem saying that Oregon beats them by 15. And let me ask you this, James. Now we're in an era that, and I could be wrong, you still want to have a stylized victory to where how you won meant something in the past when there wasn't a 12-team playoffs. Do you think that teams view lesser teams that, and particularly coming off of a clunker, that they want to have a stylized victory? Or is it more of a situation where, you know what, let's kind of get some of these younger players who we may need throughout the season in and get them some tick compared to in the past where you wanted to blow a team out, particularly if you, depending on your schedule and how the strength of schedule was, you really want to let the voters know who was who and that you need to put us in said national championship game or AP poll, coaches poll, or whatever it was back in the day.
I think with this, especially like this Oregon team specifically, what they're probably looking for is they're just going to look for some confidence to build upon, right? Like I think Dan Lanning called the win over Idaho strenuous, and I thought that was a really appropriate way of phrasing it. It took them a lot more effort to win that game than I thought that it did, but you also saw Oregon kind of rest a few guys during the course of the game. I think Jeffrey Bassa basically did not play the entire second half, one of their better defensive players. You saw Dylan Gabriel kind of flexing his hand at times. You wonder if maybe he handed the ball off a few more times early on in the game than he perhaps would have if he hadn't hit his hand on one of his teammates. Those kinds of things I think you're going to see more often where you're prioritizing health over just blowing a team out. But I also think that at a certain point, you want to get that level of confidence going up, especially in Oregon's case, where after Boise State, they play Oregon State next. And the Civil War game is always a super, heavy, fraught, emotional showdown. And I would have to think that they're going to want to start to kind of ratchet up the intensity and the confidence going into that game. And I think perhaps that ultimately matters a little bit more than the style of the victory. I just think you want to have that confidence going into that game and then ultimately into Big Ten play, because you've got those games coming up against teams like Michigan, like Ohio State. Like they need to be kind of in an ascension angle here, and they just need to start moving up. And I thought that Idaho game, it was good to get a tough one out of the way early, but if they have another really tight game against Boise State, I'm not as confident that that's going to end up benefiting them. I think they need to really come out and make a statement against Boise State and really show that the arrows are pointing up.
I agree. I totally agree with you. Great point, James.
I think that this game, I would say that I'm going to end up picking Boise State. I don't think that's a win, but not to lose by 19.5 points. I think I'm going to end up going with the Broncos. I just think that Oregon is going to score their points, but I think that Boise State is going to be really hard to kind of corral. They had 200-yard rushers last week. They rushed for 371 yards. Like, that is no joke. I think that is going to be a point of emphasis for them. They're going to try to take the air out of the football a little bit, keep it out of Dylan Gabriel's hands as much as they can. And I just don't think that they're going to lose by more than 19 points. So I'm going with the Broncos. What about you?
I want to be the contrarian, but your slick self took all the meat off of the bone at the end of that to the point that I was going to make. And that was, of course, the fact that when you can rush the ball like Boise State, you can keep Dylan Gabriel and the offense off of the field, not allowing them to be able to put up 20 points. Yep. So yeah, I want to go with Oregon because I really feel like I do, but it's just when you can run the ball like that. I guess this is the thing, James, before we switch off of this. This is the problem that I'm thinking about. What if Oregon goes up by 15 early, and then and of course, initially, Boise State still early in the game, don't play yourself, stick to what you can do, right? But if it gets to the point where we get to the halfway mark and Oregon is up by 17 or 20 points, you're going to have to become a passing team. And once you become a passing team, you basically fall. I'm going to go with Oregon. Forget it. I'll take Oregon in this one. I'll take Oregon.
I think to your point, I saw in that Boise State game, they were able to pass the ball at times. They had a couple of different guys, I think, that were over 45 receiving yards. I think they had 3 receivers that went over that. Maddox Madsen, who, by the way, every time I think I see his name, I always think of those old Mad Max Madsen radio ads that they always used to play for like the Mitsubishi dealership. I didn't realize that. He's mad.
Mad
Madsen. Yeah, so free plug apparently for that dealership if it still exists. But every time I see Maddox Madsen, I always think of that. I'm like, oh my God, I didn't realize that he played college football at Boise State. That's that's sure something. So anyway, all right, well, we've got we now have our first difference of opinion on a game, which is very nice. All right, Ken, we need to pick a third game because we are going to end up picking Nebraska, Colorado, and Michigan, Texas. We need to pick one more game. And so I'm going to throw this to you, and I'm genuinely curious would you rather make a pick in the Kansas-Illinois game, or would you rather go with Michigan State and Maryland since that's a Big Ten game? What are you thinking?
I don't want to go against Illinois this early in the season, so I don't want to pick
They're
Kansas
only a 5-point dog to Kansas this week. I think this is an interesting matchup because we saw what Illinois did on defense last week, and I was honestly really impressed with the way after the first drive by EIU, they really buckled down and they really made it hard for EIU to do absolutely anything on offense. I mean, you shut a team out, you're obviously going to be in good shape, but I was genuinely impressed with a lot of the defensive play that I was seeing from that group. And I know we focused a lot on the secondary going into the season. I thought their linebacker core looked excellent against EIU. They were really clogging up the middle of the field, just would not allow any short passes. They were limiting the run game really well. But at the same time, this is Kansas we're talking about. This is a team that they basically get off the bus and they are just rocking and rolling on the ground. They rushed for 331 yards last week in their first game of the season. They had Devin Neal go off for 112 yards. He had a couple of touchdowns. They had touchdowns from Daniel Hishaw and Sevion Morrison. Like, they are a team that is going to really run the rock. And I'm genuinely curious if you're taking away from what Illinois was able to do in their secondary with the way they were able to build it this offseason and to attack that defensive line that we're still learning about. That's where I wonder if maybe Kansas has a little bit more of an edge than that low of a point spread would kind of indicate.
Well, one thing is, and speaking of the run game, when you're talking about Kansas, and we talked to Jeremy about this, but also a tad bit with head coach Brett Bielema. Let's not forget that the linebacking core's new nickname is the new law firm also. So that's going to benefit you in stopping the run. But you're right, on the backside. I think one thing we have to agree, and it kind of starts off with the Lovey era, that when we're going to have to start looking at Illinois defensively, and they have a couple more steps, kind of how we look at Minnesota, where you know what, they may lose some guys, but the program is built to where they know who to recruit to bring in to kind of keep that defense going. It's just that offensively, Kansas can get you, you know, and I don't know if look, I'm here for Luke all the time. But man, it was those Paddock games where it was like I could see your Texas right now last year, where it got crazy. And I don't know if they're at that point offensively where people missed out on some really interesting, I won't say great because of expectations may limit me from staying great, but exciting, I should say. Some really exciting Illinois games last year to where they were out and then you look, either they came back or they got right to the line and victory was snatched away from their jaws of defeat. For me personally, I think I'm going to go with Kansas. Of course, people I know it's ad nauseum. You're sick of us saying it's our local school. James went there. I was going to go there. But I decided to take myself where I couldn't get in. I didn't try. I didn't attempt to.
You took your talents to Carbondale. It's totally fine.
I took my talents, but I was actually before sophomore year. Was like, should I transfer? But I decided to enjoy the weather at the southern tip of the state, which is better than any place else in the state. But yeah, I'm going to go with Kansas, but I hope I'm wrong. I will proudly take this L if Illinois can pull this off. Even if they don't pull it off, but they can make sure that it's lower than 5 points.
What I kind of will say about Illinois is they were able to rush the ball a little bit last week, but I thought that they didn't really give Josh McCray a lot of run. They only gave him 5 carries, which I found fascinating. They were a lot more focused on Aiden Lafferty and Caden Fagan, who had 108 yards rushing and a touchdown in that game. I like the way that they use those two. I want to see a little bit more out of Josh McCray, and then I want Illinois to continue spreading the ball around the way that they were able to do last week. I think they had like 11 different guys get catches last week. Like, they were not screwing around. They got Pat Bryant and Malik Elzy active real early in that game. Zachary Franklin also flashed a couple of times in that game. I just think that Illinois, they've got interesting weapons. I'm not sure they have like an Isaiah Williams level threat that they can just go to immediately. I don't think that Malik Elzy or Pat Bryant is that guy. But having both of them potentially be active in that passing game, I do think will ultimately help Luke Altmaier. All of that being said, I just think this Kansas team has got a really good shot at making some serious noise in the Big 12 this season. I'm glad this game is at home for Illinois because I do think it's going to get kept a lot closer. I still think Kansas is going to win by a touchdown. So I do have to go with the Jayhawks, but I do think that this game is going to be a very, very competitive one. And I'm hoping that it is.
Yeah, me too, James.
All right, folks, we're going to switch gears here and we're going to get to the meat of these conversations of what we think are the two best games of the Big Ten slate this week. And to help us out with one of those, we have on a returning guest who helped us preview the Nebraska season. He is Luke Mullin from the Lincoln Journal-Star. He covers all things Cornhuskers, does so very well, I might add, and is here to join us to talk about Nebraska as they try to get revenge on Colorado. How you doing today, Luke?
Hey guys, doing well. Thanks for having me back. It was a long few weeks without hearing from you. I was like, oh man, what's going on here?
Oh yeah, it was such a long stretch. We try not to pester people too often. We were like, is it too early in the season to get Luke back on? This is a big game, so we appreciated you responding in the affirmative, man. Well, you know what? We are too, because this is a game we kind of had circled, especially after what happened last season between these two teams and the hype that we've really seen, frankly, around both programs this year. And I love the way that Matt Rule was kind of downplaying stuff a little bit yesterday. I loved they went into, it's not like I'm not going to wear black. I'm not going to not say Colorado. That's kind of his attitude towards it. Is that just kind of the overall vibe you're getting from the team as they prepare for this game, that they're kind of trying to treat it as just another opportunity to get a W and not like a potential revenge game against one of the most hyped teams in the country?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Matt Rule, he's an old school East Coast, football coach. He's the type of coach that is going to view every matchup the same way, regardless of who the opponent is. And that being said, I mean, make no mistake. I mean, they understand how big this game is. They understand all the national attention. There's going to be a ton of recruits there on the sideline, guys who could be the future of this Nebraska football program. It's about selling kind of a vision for the future. If they win this, hey, look at Dylan Raiola. Look at this new high-powered offense that Nebraska has. This is a program on the rise. If they lose, I mean, it's the same issues that we can be treading all over again. Is Nebraska going to be back? Are they ever going to make it? So we have these huge, overarching issues, but I think Matt Rule's very smart in the way he approaches it. He doesn't want any of that to distract them, from the on-field standpoint. So very much that's been the message this week, to block out all that noise. If they win, they'll get to enjoy, all the attention that comes with it. And if they lose, they'll be glad, I think, that they blocked out all the noise. So that's kind of been the atmosphere, the mindset here so far in Lincoln.
What do you think, from a small sample size in the victory this past week, you can see the difference from the team last year and the loss last year that can benefit Nebraska going into this game this season?
Yeah, I mean, it is night and day how this offense operates. I mean, last year, realistically, there's a reason why Nebraska was one of the worst passing offenses in the country. I mean, just didn't have the top level talent there at quarterback, didn't have the wide receivers who could separate, run themselves open there in the passing game. And yes, it was week one, it was UTEP. It was an overmatched team that, was dealing with its own attrition, its own roster turnover, first year head coach in there. It was a tough spot for them to be in, but the aggressiveness that Nebraska had in the pass game, the ability to trust those players to say, hey, we're going to throw a back shoulder fade here in the end zone with 10 seconds left. Raiola, he's not going to get picked off. He's not going to throw that ball to the wrong shoulder. That's exactly what happened. He threw a touchdown for what last year would have been an interception. I mean, it was completely night and day the way that they trusted Raiola to operate the offense, to go out there and throw the ball. And of course, a big thing we were watching here in Lincoln was last year. I mean, they ran the quarterback run game exclusively. I mean, every time 10, 15 quarterback runs a game, Raiola, he got hit once in the pocket, sacked once. They're not going to run him, not going to risk that. They're going to let him go to work in the pocket. It was a different look to the Nebraska offense, but it was much more high-powered than we saw last year.
I was actually going to mention that because even though Heinrich Haarberg did get in for a few snaps in that game, he only rushed the ball twice and he threw it 5 times, which I thought was just a really interesting utilization. And I think, to what you said, kind of a really rethinking of how they're going to approach this thing offensively. Was that something they had talked about often in camp, that they were really going to focus on strictly passing the ball? Or was this something that maybe was a little bit of a wrinkle that kind of got thrown in against UTEP for this week?
Yeah, they definitely played it close to the vest. I think it was kind of understood, right, that you're not going to put Raiola up there, make him run, these quarterback runs and, take a pounding up the middle for the 5-yard draws that Harburg was running all season throughout 2023. But at the same time, I mean, there might be some RPO elements to this offense. They kept it very, very vanilla there in week 1. I think they understood that anything that they put on film, obviously the Buffaloes are going to be watching all week long. So I think, Raiola, everybody talks about him. I mean, he moves very well in the pocket. We've seen him extend plays just in the practices and that 1 week of game action that we saw from him. So I think there is that potential, to run some bootlegs to get him outside of the pocket, use those legs a little bit. But yeah, none of the quarterback draw up the middle. That is just completely out of the playbook at this point.
On the flip side, we still see some of the same issues with Colorado with protection of the quarterback and how that affects the running game. But you still have one of the best accurate quarterbacks in the country in Shedeur Sanders, and the legend of Travis Hunter is just growing. So how will Nebraska try to stifle those two players with what is right now still an issue with the offensive line of the Buffaloes?
Yeah, I mean, great point. And I think you said it all there. It all comes down to how that offensive line is going to play, because if you look back to last year's Nebraska-Colorado matchup, I mean, Shedeur Sanders was running for his life back there. Nebraska sacked him 8 times, like 8 sacks in one game. I mean, it was just completely astonishing to watch. But at the same time, every time he had time in the pocket, he was picking apart that secondary. So it was kind of like the risk reward, for Colorado. They knew Shedeur was going to get hit. He was going to take a beating back there, but that was what they needed to do to win the game. And I think it could be something similar this time. This Nebraska defensive line, it's veteran heavy. They were completely overpowering UTEP. UTEP was just having to chop block them every play because they knew they couldn't block for 2 or 3 seconds. I mean, their quarterback wouldn't even have that time in the pocket. So it'll be a little bit different equation for Colorado there. Obviously they need that downfield passing game, those big play threats that you mentioned, Travis Hunter, Jimmy Horn, all these different talented wide receivers. So it's going to be a case of, can the defensive line hit home? And then the other question mark is, how does this Nebraska secondary look? Because Tommy Hill, he's the standout cornerback in that room. He's got some NFL draft buzz, like could be a first-round pick. Well, if you want to prove it, I mean, go out and lock down Travis Hunter. I mean, that is the way to prove yourself, to make a name. Marquise Buford, former safety turned cornerback. He's the other starter on the other side of the field. It was pretty solid last week, but it's going to be a test for him to keep up with the speed, the explosiveness of some of these wide receivers. But I do think that, the way that the offensive line handles pressure, that's going to really dictate how much time Shedeur has in that pocket and whether he can pick apart this Nebraska defense once again.
I was really surprised when I saw the Nebraska only had 1 sack against UTEP. I would have thought it would have been more than that, just given how they were kind of dominating that battle up front. Is that something that worried you at all, that they only had the 1, or do you think that you saw enough from them in terms of getting pressure on the quarterback that you think they're going to be able to hurry up Shedeur Sanders a little bit and to really get him kind of out of his rhythm in that game?
Yeah, I could not be any less worried about the Nebraska defensive line. In particular, just because UTEP, they were game planning to get the ball out quick and to spread the field, just to really reduce the effectiveness of that Nebraska D-line. And I mean, they didn't blitz the entire time. It was a 3-man or 4-man rush. It was just base defense, let those guys go to work. And then the other interesting factor here is too, those D linemen, they didn't have a productive day, their most productive day, but they only played about 15 to 20 snaps. The starters did. I mean, Colorado, that was a 4-quarter game. Those guys were out there the whole time. I guess they have a couple extra days to recover, but it was really a case where this Nebraska defense was not tested to the fullest of its capabilities there against UTEP.
Luke, how should, in your opinion, Nebraska try to take the air out of the ball with their run game? And also, how about now, since you have, at this point, it's early, but I'm rooting for Nebraska, you have could be a special quarterback, all right, in Dylan Raiola. But how are they going to go about, and it's early, and you can't show, you've mentioned the vanilla-ness and just it's snaps, low snap count for the defensive linemen. How are they trying to marry the running game with the passing game now that, those DBs have to back up some now with a guy that can get that ball out of the pocket like Dylan Raiola?
Yeah, they were definitely, I think, cognizant in week 1 about setting up the play action looks, making sure that they were able to establish the run early. And, not get into a situation where Raiola is going to need to throw it, 40, 50 times a game, because that could be possible. This could easily be, high scoring back and forth possessions, with this Colorado team. So that's going to be really important to establish that run game. And I will say in that regard, I was very pleased with how the Nebraska offensive line played last week. It's a unit that had needed some upward trajectory, had maybe kind of been stagnant a little bit in that run game. I mean, they were making all sorts of different gaps and lanes for those running backs to run through against UTEP. And, again, different challenge against Colorado than against UTEP, but they were firing off. They were doing all that they needed to do to create those lanes up front. And then the other thing is Nebraska. I mean, they don't have a de facto starting running back. They have several different guys that they like that they're going to rotate in there. And it was a big surprise for us in Lincoln, actually, to see Dante Dowdle get the bulk of those carries to be the starter out there in those first couple of series prior to fumbling, because he was a guy in the spring that was fourth on the depth chart. I mean, he was the transfer, the returners were there. So really, I think for Colorado, it's going to be difficult to know which back to prepare for. You got Dowdle and you've got Irvin, kind of more the bruisers, the all-around guys. Ramir and Emmett Johnson, those were the third down backs, the pass catchers, shifty, elusive guys who can run with a little bit of power too. So I think Nebraska's going to pull all the tricks out of the bag. They're going to run inside, outside. They're going to utilize all those backs just to get that run game going and keep Colorado off guard a little bit.
Do you think it's safe to assume Dylan Raiola is going to throw the ball more than 27 times against Colorado? It felt like they went real run heavy against UTEP for obvious reasons. They had a lot of success in that area. Dylan Raiola didn't have to throw the ball that much. I would expect a little bit more of an even split in this game between those two. Do you think that's a fair assessment of what you could potentially see against Colorado?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I mean, a big factor, Nebraska controlled the time of possession. I mean, it was kind of stylistic too, because UTEP, their coaching style, they wanted to run it up tempo, no huddle, go out and rush to the line of scrimmage, get those guys set. Well, when you don't have so many possessions, that really tends to weigh on you. And that did happen. Raiola also out of the game, by mid to late third quarter. So didn't even play the full game for him either. Yeah, certainly I think we can expect to see those pass attempts go up. And from everything that the Nebraska coaching staff has been saying, I mean, they are ready to go out and be aggressive. They're ready to do that in week 1. They're going to do it in week 2. It doesn't matter the opponent, the stage. I mean, they're going to let that guy go out there and chuck it around.
I got a couple more questions, but one, redshirting Malachi Coleman. What's going on for everybody that doesn't know about Malachi?
Yeah, so I mean, he's a fan favorite, a Lincoln kid, a local kid. Who came on last year. I mean, there were a flurry of injuries at the wide receiver position, and he was a key wide receiver, played over 300 snaps, played in almost every game for Nebraska, was a key starter down the stretch. But this year, it's kind of a testament to where this offense has grown, the steps it's taken, that you have a guy like that who has a ton of talent, raw potential that they want to develop. Well, I mean, a lot of programs, you don't have that luxury. Like you got to get your best players out there on the field, right? But Nebraska, they have the impact transfer wide receivers, Isaiah Nair, Jamal Banks come in and kind of Coleman's spot as that, big target there who can stretch the field on the outside. I mean, now you got 2 guys who are there ahead of him, 2 seniors who will be graduating out of the program in the next year. So it's really a long-term vision that Matt Rule has, saying, hey, I mean, if this guy isn't going to be out there playing 30, 40 snaps a game as a game changer, like we don't need to burn a red shirt. So, he can play on the second team and, get 5 snaps a game and, end the year with 5-10 catches. I mean, that's a guy that they want to be a future difference maker at the wide receiver position. So that's the plan right now. With all the injuries that happened last year, I'm not going to say that we're guaranteed not to see him on the field, but it really does show, I think, just how much this Nebraska offense has improved, that an exciting young wide receiver like Coleman, you can consider redshirting him this year.
Can I have more of a big picture question if you have any more questions about this particular game?
No, go right ahead.
I was literally just going to ask you, the new AP poll came out today. Nebraska wasn't ranked. What was up with that, Luke?
Yeah, I think nobody's putting the cart before the horse here. But if they win this one, I mean, they gotta be in that discussion, right?
One would think. Yeah, I think that this is a game, especially with what happened last year and how quickly it got out of hand in terms of the score line and Colorado kind of getting that hype going. I think that a lot of voters are perhaps being cautious about that, but I would think a 2-0 start with the quality of wins they could potentially have, I would personally put them in top 25 if they win this game. Would you do the same?
Yeah, I think I would, and thankfully it's my coworker Amy Just here at the Journal Star who has to do the AP Top 25, not me. So I don't have to deal with the angry college football fans in my DMs and my notifications saying, "Hey, you put us at 21."
You might still have to. You never know. Like people may be mistaken. All right,
I mean,
go ahead, buddy.
Certainly the way that Nebraska started the year, the talent this team has. I mean, the fact that they play in the Big Ten is obviously part of that too. You know that they're going to be tested, and the way that the schedule shapes up too. I mean, if they aren't ranked against Colorado, I mean, they could easily be ranked in any of the ensuing weeks that follow. If it does go as it does, it's a very favorable schedule here to open the year. So, I mean, there was a lot of talk coming into the season about that Ohio State game. Is Nebraska going to be undefeated? Are they going to be 7-0 going in? Well, still a lot of wins to pick up before you get there. But this was the biggest one that people said, hey, if there's going to be any stumbling block in this early half of the season, it's this Colorado game.
Luke, one of the things that we talked about prior to the season commencing was just how transformative Dylan Raiola could be because of recruiting. And it's funny because you look at the different styles of, Colorado with the transfer portal, and you look at Matt Rule trying to do it the traditional way. But you hinted about the fact that they are recruits that are going to be there for this game and what it could mean if they do get a victory. One, which of those recruits, if you know, stand out to you? But also, do you think if Dylan Raiola and Matt Rule continue to progress, perhaps some of the style could change to where perhaps the transfer portal and NIL could open up a little bit more because, one, more people would be willing to provide that. But also, just to be the top tier contender, you kind of have to have, access to that type of capital if you want to be at the top of the Big Ten or any conference, in the top conference in college. Okay, SEC, the Big Ten, let me just say that, in college football.
Yeah, no, I mean, good point about the transfer portal. I mean, this was really kind of a stylistic choice when Matt Rule took over. He looked at the roster and, like any head coach coming in, you're going to want to turn that roster over, identify the guys who are underperforming, get some new talent in. And by and large, the way that Matt Rule chose to do that was by recruiting high school players. I mean, they did attack that transfer portal there early, that first offseason that he had. But this last offseason, there was less in the portal, more to high school. And a big point of that is Matt Rule, he wants this to be a development program. He's, like I said, I mean, he's that old school coach that, I mean, he grew up as a walk-on. I mean, he grew up as players, struggling and grinding there on the practice field for 3 to 4 years, just to play as seniors. And obviously this is a different, college football landscape that doesn't exist anymore. You can hop ship if you're a talented recruit, but he still believes in that importance of getting guys in the program when they're young, letting them understand the way to do things, develop, and then come on strong here down the end. Now, if Dylan Raiola does play at the level that we think he can, if Nebraska does, ultimately end up in that conversation as being one of those top teams in the Big Ten, absolutely, they will go hard in the portal. They will find those impact positions that you need those one-year transfers at. They'll go for them. But I just don't see a situation where Nebraska really pursues that as the main thing. It's really the recruiting from the high school level is what they like. And this upcoming weekend, they've got a big 2026 quarterback, Nicholas Clayton. He's going to be in there. Guess who? A different 2026 quarterback was on the sidelines last week. Dayton Raiola. He likes Nebraska too. So there's a lot of interest there. A lot of the top kids from around the Midwest are going to be here in Lincoln this week because they were just very intentional about that. They knew it was going to be a big draw night game. They get the recruits in, and obviously if they win that one, it'll only reflect even better on Nebraska.
Nebraska, Colorado coming up Saturday night, 6:30 p.m. Kickoff will be seen on NBC. Shameless plug. We have to throw that out there. Luke, we really appreciate you joining us. And the last question I had for you is, you think Colorado's going to win, or Nebraska rather, is going to win this game? Are you picking the Huskers in this one?
Yep, I am. I'm picking Nebraska. I believe that Raiola, he's ready to make a difference. This offense is at a different level than it was last year. The defense, I think they're going to give that offensive line a lot of trouble. And then another factor that we haven't even brought up yet is the crowd. I mean, people in Nebraska, people at Memorial Stadium, they are going to be out for blood on Saturday. This is 3 straight losses to Colorado since this series resumed a few years ago. Last 2 out in Boulder. the way that last year ended. I mean, Colorado has stormed the field for both of those wins that they had out in Boulder. I mean, they were ready to beat Nebraska. Nebraska's been on the losing end of those matchups, and fans are angry. They're worked up. They've been circling this matchup for months, and it's going to be one heck of an atmosphere.
There is nothing that I like more than seeing a great sporting venue on a night like this. And I think the Red Sea is going to be in full force on Saturday. Cannot wait to see it. Luke, thank you so much for giving us so much of your time today. We really appreciate it. And try to have some fun in the press box on Saturday night. I know these rivalry games, you get a lot of stuff that you have to do, but make sure you soak in that atmosphere on behalf of Ken and I, man. Thank you so much.
I'm going to be feeling the goosebumps, guys. Don't worry.
Awesome. Thank you, man. All right, folks, we're going to continue our week 2 previews with probably the biggest game, I would argue, of the Big Ten weekend. It is the reigning national champions, Michigan, taking on one of the teams that's probably one of the biggest contenders for a national title this season. The Texas Longhorns head up to the Big House, and to preview the game, we welcome back on a recurring guest on the program. He is Isaiah Hull. He covers Michigan for USA Today, Wolverines Wire, and is the co-host of Locked On Wolverines. Isaiah, thank you so much for joining us, man. We really appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. I am just the host. If I have a co-host, I'd be curious to see who that might be. Some people want that to happen. I'm like, no, that's not happening.
Listen, man, I'm not actively rooting for you to have your power usurped. I just clearly can't read. It's a terrible affliction I have.
So you're just getting me. You're not getting any. Well, sometimes I've got David Pollock on the show today, and I'm editing that. So sometimes I have a co-host, but it's few and far between.
You know, having a co-host is one of those things that it can go really wrong very quickly. But honestly, all right, that was hideously mean, and I apologize to Ken profusely for that, and he can beat me up later. But
we're good.
Maybe we can talk some football and we can move past this awkwardness. It was I got to say an interesting game against Fresno State in week 1 for Michigan. I think that it's hard to know what to expect when you have so many players that end up getting replaced from such a talented team, and just kind of watching them like grow into the game a little bit. You kind of could see the slow momentum of guys kind of getting their feet underneath them. But I'm curious from your perspective, covering this team as closely as you do, what was your takeaway from that week 1 game for Michigan, the way that they ended up playing against Fresno State?
Well, my take in game was it's weird because in some ways it's much different than my takeaway post game. But some of the same kind of lessons applied. I certainly wasn't impressed by a lot of things in that game from an offensive standpoint. But I also recognized in the moment that Michigan might have been tinkering. Fresno State's no joke of an opponent, even being a group of 5, right? Michigan's played some of the worst group of 5 teams to open up the season in the last 2 years, maybe even 3. And Fresno State is the best of all of those. And they're the type of team that likes to take a lot of other teams to the brink. Sometimes they win some. They've been a kind of perennial 8-4, 9-3 team. And the only games they tend to lose are against those high-end Power 5 teams. And sometimes they lose by 20 like they did against Michigan. And sometimes they lose by 3. But they also went out and beat Purdue and Arizona State last year, and the latter being very convincing. So you kind of don't really know what you're getting with them because they're a little bit better. But there are some things that offensively you look at and you say, is this just because these are the guys' first time playing together? And it seems like that was kind of the case in a lot of ways, just some misassignments, 10 guys doing the right job and the 11th maybe not doing that. So like I looked at the offensive line and I said, that was definitely a trouble area. It's kind of concerning to see that the offensive line wasn't quite as good as you thought, but then you kind of go back and rewatch it and realize that, okay, it's exactly that. One missed assignment. That guy was fine for the rest of the game. But a lot of people look at like Dom Judice and getting pushed back off the ball on that 3rd and 1. But he generally kind of had an okay game. But Michigan was also very vanilla in a lot of ways. They really passed the ball horizontally rather than vertically. But then when it came crunch time, it looked like the Michigan offense. The first drive of the game, the last drive of the first half, and the last drive of the game offensively looked like what we've kind of been used to seeing from Michigan football. And then in between, it just seemed like they were working guys in, working players out, trying to see kind of what they have. So if that is the case, which we'll know, obviously we'll know against Texas, was that Michigan trying to figure things out before Texas to see like, okay, this is what we have? This is what we know we can do. These are the types of things that we need to clean up beforehand, or is this just who they are? And we don't really have a solid answer on that, but I do feel like they were tinkering. And I would imagine it'll be somewhere in the middle, right? What the offense won't be as dynamic as it was by the season's end last year against Alabama in the Rose Bowl, but I think it will look a little bit more cohesive than it did against Fresno State. Defensively, I mean, it still looked amazing. The only touchdown that Fresno State scored was when Michigan was very much tinkering with personnel. You had guys out there that we've never seen before and we're probably not expecting to see. They were able to kind of march down the field, but you saw some of the players really shine. You saw even some struggles. Will Johnson didn't have his best game, but then he eventually was Will Johnson again, right? Fresno State decided they were going to target him frequently, which is a choice, and eventually it caught up to them, and they paid the price. And I think that because of what Michigan is defensively, it will allow the offense to not tinker, but certainly be able to have maybe a drive or two to figure things out before it becomes a dire circumstance.
Isaiah, you kind of answered my question when you said they're tinkering in this game and help us find out perhaps if they're in the middle. Where do you expect them with these new players to be if everything works out well? But also, we didn't see as much as we expected of Donovan Edwards, but it's the beginning of the season. As you said, Fresno State is better. We talked about that in our post game of these games. Don't sleep on Fresno State. They bring in players. They can do what they need to do. But what offensive players right now, as they're transitioning, should they perhaps really feature or depend on to bring them some success moving into the season?
I know a lot of people are down on Donovan Edwards, and I know he, I don't want to say I spoke to him after the game. I got his immediate reaction on the field after the game, which was kind of like a, you know. I know he's as frustrated as the fans are about him not having that production, and his one big play got called back due to a holding. But at the same time, I think that he's the guy you got to get going. And maybe that does mean you have to ride Kalel for a little while because, I mean, he was averaging 6 yards per carry. He looked amazing. But Donovan Edwards historically has shown up in the big games, not the smaller ones. It's like something clicks in his mind and he wants to show up in those smaller games, but it's the ones where the lights are shining the brightest. You look at Penn State 2022, Ohio State that year, Big Ten championship, college football playoff, and then Penn State this last year didn't really show up against Ohio State or Iowa or Alabama, but then again in the national championship game, wasted no time. They call him Big Play Don for a reason, or Big Game Don for a reason, and it's because he shows up in those giant games. So I would still really try to get him going, and I would do so by utilizing kind of all of his talents and being, using him in a little bit more of a versatile fashion. They did that against Penn State last year. Tried to just find a ways to get the ball in his hands, get him in space, right? He's not a typical between the tackles guy. So I would imagine they'll have a plan for him to try to get him going a little bit earlier. But ultimately, if I'm Michigan, I think the big key is just the offensive line and the run game in general. Like, people like to look at Davis Warren and say, well, he's not that 4-star quarterback, or in JJ McCarthy's case, a 5-star. How are they going to do things? People get they overlook what Michigan was built like, right? Michigan won its first Big Ten championship in eons and beat Ohio State with Cade McNamara. And Cade McNamara isn't exactly, even though he's a 4-star, wasn't exactly playing like a 4-star. He was just kind of a game manager. They never asked him to really go out there and throw for 300 yards. They were asking him to throw for maybe 200. And I think you can get that from Davis Warren, but you're going to get it if you can run the football. The inverse of that, unfortunately, might be, because I think Fresno State was stacking the box a lot. I'd imagine Texas is going to do the same thing. They're going to say, well, we want Davis Warren to beat us with his arm. Well, you've got to have to make them push back off of that a little bit. And that's where you can use Colston Loveland. Obviously, everyone's going to hone in on him, but he's kind of, you can't really bracket him. He's a 6'6" receiver, essentially, as a tight end, and still can block. You can move him around the field like they did last week and just create mismatches. You can't really put a linebacker on him because he's too fast. You can't put a safety on him for this kind of the same reason, and he's too big for a corner. So it's kind of like, what do you do? So if I'm Michigan, I'm trying to get that going a little bit, right? Looking at PFF, Davis Warren wasn't phenomenal when it came to play action. Yet, I think that Michigan's best kind of their goal should be against Texas to really try to find that play action game, get Warren settled in just so he can make some of those throws that we saw kind of later in the game. You know, he looked crisp by the end of the game. So it's
Mhm.
just about creating some confidence for him. And I think if you can do that early in a game like Texas, you know, show like, hey, yeah, I can play against this team. I can make throws against this defense. What are we talking about? This is still just football. Then Michigan's in a good shot, and just rely on your defense to and play complementary football. That's what Michigan wants to do, and that's what they need to do. Rely on that run game, burn some clock, keep the ball out of more high-powered offenses' hands. That goes beyond Texas, that goes to USC, that goes to Washington, that goes to Oregon, that goes to Ohio State. Try to shorten the game a bit and force them to kind of contend with the physicality you have up front.
Do you think there's any way that I know obviously they were kind of swapping quarterbacks in and out at times during that game. Do you think that they're going to stick more with Davis Warren because it is more of that wanting to get him into the rhythm and perhaps get the passing game going a little bit more? Or do you still see them continuing to do the kind of, have Davis Warren come in, bring in Alex Orji for a few plays? Do you see them kind of continuing to mix and match those quarterbacks in this Texas game?
Yeah, I do because in large part because Sherrod Morris said that that's the plan. He said that on radio yesterday.
Ah,
The plan is to work in more packages for Alex Orji. You got to get his arm going as well. Obviously, he had the touchdown pass to open the game, and then he couldn't hit the broadside of a barn on his next pass. So he's 2 for 3. He's still throwing for 66% on his career. But I think that they want to be able to mix things up. I think that they're going to continue to try to basically make it so that Alex Orgy has every opportunity to still even in season kind of win the job because he's just got the highest upside. And it's one of those things where it's like if he could figure it out, it's a Jalen Milroe type situation in Alabama. And people act like Jalen Milroe was always the answer in Tuscaloosa. It wasn't until really like halfway through the season last year they were starting him. He didn't look good. They lost to Texas in week 2. They benched him against USF. They brought him back in, and it still took him a couple weeks before he started to all of a sudden you're like, oh, okay, this guy can play. I think Michigan's probably trying to do that without necessarily starting him right off the bat because I think they recognize Davis Warren's our best opportunity to win early. But if we could get Alex Orji, if we could get him to kind of figure things out and become that, the type of player we think he's capable of being, then that gives us a better opportunity to go not only to the college football playoff, but make another deep run in it.
Could it also be situational? Because it's funny, and I was going to go there with Alex Orji and Jalen Miro, because you have Steve Sarkisian talking about how he's that threat and mentioning the fact that he does have the arm capabilities to go deep. Can you at times, for instance, game by game, feature Alex Orji more? Or in some ways, a lot of people don't believe in platooning quarterbacks, and it's really feature the best guy because you want to keep him crisp, and that could be Davis. Like, is that a catch-22? I guess is the question I'm trying to ask you.
It is a catch-22, and it's one of those things that people kind of go both ways on this idea of like, if you have 2 quarterbacks, you have none. I do think you'll see Orji situationally, but I remember 2018 driving home the morning after the Notre Dame game for Michigan and listening to Sirius XM, and Barrett Slee and Tom Luganbill are like, because they're looking at Clemson and Alabama in that time. You had Jalen Hurts and Tua Tagovailoa on one side, and you had Trevor Lawrence. I'm going nuts. Sorry, I don't exactly even remember the other quarterback that Clemson had in that moment, but there was Kelly something that shows you how he ended up doing.
Yeah,
But they were proclaiming that like if you don't have 2 quarterbacks, you're not with today's college football. I think it all just depends on how it works, and I think Michigan's going to try to find a way to make it work. And I'm curious to see just kind of what they do because if they are going to work them in, yeah, I do think it will be situational, but you also don't want to be predictable. But if you have to force them to account for a quarterback in certain downs and distances, different situations, different areas of the field, it definitely can be a bigger threat than just having your drop back guy. Because if you have your drop back guy and you're in 3rd and 6 or something like that, he's passing the ball. You don't know what's going to happen if it's Alex Orji out there because he could drop back to pass and then see like, okay, I got an opening, I'm going to go, or he could still throw. So I think that maybe in those 3rd and mediums, that's where he could really be lethal because he presents a couple different options if he can figure out his arm. And I think that would be kind of in Michigan's best interest until it can essentially get one or the other to essentially be that guy.
Mm-hmm. To lock down the job. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an interesting way of handling things. And Michigan has kind of been put in a position where they are going to have to kind of work through those things, and having a team like Texas second week of the season, not exactly the easiest way to go about it. But I did want to ask you one more question about the offensive weapons that Michigan is bringing into this thing, because you mentioned Colston Loveland earlier. Ken knows I am over the moon for him. I think he is an absolutely phenomenal pass catching weapon. I think he's going to be a holy terror on Sundays in the NFL. But then you look at the rest of the pass catching options that Michigan is bringing to the table this season, and there's still, of course, plenty of questions about it. So my question to you is, outside of Colston Loveland, do you see a receiver or two that's potentially going to be able to get a little bit heavier workload in this Texas game and kind of ease some of the pressure on Colston and give Texas something else to think about?
I'll give you three names there, and and a kind of bonus fourth. As far as receivers are concerned, I would really look at both Tyler Morris and Samaj Morgan. They tried to get Tyler Morris going a little bit more in week one. He's a former 4-star. He was a guy that would have been in contention for 5-star status if you listen to some of the people who like really evaluated him in the recruiting process. But then he tore his ACL going into his senior year, and that kind of took him off of the top of the board, and people weren't over the moon for him anymore. This is his third year. He's the veteran in the receiver room. He had that big touchdown against Alabama, showed off his speed as he outran the entirety of the Alabama defense in the Rose Bowl. He's more of your slot guy, but they really like him, and they're over the moon for him. But Samaj Morgan's the other guy. He's been kind of more of a gadget player, but you've seen him make some downfield plays. His first touchdown catch against Rutgers was, he ran a post route, if memory serves, and gets all the way in the end zone, out jumps, a bigger defensive back, because he's a little bit more diminutive in size, but he's got speed, and he plays much bigger than his size would suggest. So I think that getting him involved, whether it is in different kind of ways, using him on those jet sweeps or in the screen game and different things, like we saw them use him like that against Alabama. We saw them use him like that against Penn State. Those are the types of things that I would probably say that you can use him for. But then Kendrick Bell, he's Ronnie Bell's little brother. So similar to Ronnie, a guy that wasn't really highly ranked. He was a quarterback that converted to wide receiver. He's my inflection player this year. He's your bigger guy that Michigan kind of needs. They definitely tried to get him the ball a few times this last game, and I think it was a little bit surprising because I think people were looking at some other options like Fred Moore or Marion Walker. And I think that whether it's him or walk-on Peyton O'Leary, who they've been raving about for years, and I know people don't love to hear walk-ons, but Michigan's had a lot of success with some of its walk-ons in its walk-on program. So those would be those guys. But I'd also, if I'm Michigan, I'm looking to get Donovan Edwards involved in the pass game. Put him and Kalel Mullings out there at the same time. You saw them do that against Penn State last year, both of them in the backfield. And I think ultimately all of those ended up going Donovan's way as far as just handoffs, but you can use them in play action, or you can hand off to Kalel Mullings. Plenty of different things you can do with that. He might have some of the best hands on the team. So I think that they could use him as well as an offensive weapon rather than just solely being a running back. And it stands to reason why they wouldn't show that last week, because you don't want Texas to know that, hey, we still can do this. This is still in our arsenal. They've done it. He scored touchdowns as a receiver, plenty of them, but more so in 2022 than in 2023. So it'll be interesting to see if they kind of go back to that. That's a well that they just haven't tapped into. And certainly that's one that I think that they could use and probably should.
Michigan looks like it's returning in a stifling defense, but you have a new defensive coordinator in Wink Martindale. And the first thing, of course, from us, I do our Bears podcast in the pros, we think blitz when you're talking about Wink. But expectations of what else he brings, particularly in this Texas game, as you try to slow down or stop Quinn Ewers and this Texas offense.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's what he showed in the NFL, but he's sworn up and down it's situational. He's certainly blitzed quite a bit in this last game, but I think it just kind of depends on what he feels like he can do. It was a blitz that allowed that touchdown to score against Fresno State. So I think he's a little bit more interested in what he feels is going to work situationally. He's run. This is his defense that Michigan's been running for the last several years, right? So it's not like a big change. The big change is that play caller. And while we didn't see Jesse Minter, his predecessor and his acolyte, necessarily blitz a lot, he did have a game in which he did, and that was against TCU, and it didn't work out. So I'm curious to see when you're getting into a situation where you might need more guys on the back end. If maybe like against Texas, they don't necessarily try to rattle Quinn Ewers that way. Say we've got 4 guys up front who can win that job on any given down, and see how that works to kind of to start the game. And this might be the best offensive line they'll see all year. If it doesn't necessarily work out to start, they might say, okay, we're going to go for it. But I mean, defensively, it's the same thing that Michigan's been running with great success for the last couple of years. It's just a matter of how aggressive is Wink Martindale going to be. And I think it will be situational. And I think it will depend heavily on what can we do with our front four, because we've got the best duo in college football in the interior, and we've got 2 really capable edge rushers in Josiah Stewart, who had probably the best game for Michigan of anyone against Fresno State, and Derek Moore, who's right there with him. So they have them, but you're definitely, when you've got all these different receivers that Texas has, Isaiah Bond being the main one, yeah, you might want to clog up the middle, especially if you're in a zone. He does like man, but I could see him going a little bit more zone and taking things a little bit off of the plate of those linebackers and trying to keep them more in areas where those receivers might be, just because, yeah, I think that's going to be a little bit more of a necessity in a game like this.
You mentioned Isaiah Bond, and I would imagine he's going to be a big focal point of the secondary to try to limit him. Is there anybody else in that Texas receiver group who had a really solid game in week 1? They really spread the ball around really well. Is there anybody else that kind of stands out to you as being a potentially potent threat that Michigan's really going to have to kind of key in on besides Isaiah Bond?
So yeah, this is where I'm bad with names. And I'm trying to remember if it was the Houston transfer or the Oregon State transfer. One of them had a really good game, and the other one didn't. The other one only had like 1 catch for 4 yards. So whichever one that I'm referring to is the one that I would also keep my eye on. Also, they got that freshman Wingo.
Yep.
He's the one that you're really going to look out for. I mean, Michigan was trying to get Ryan Wingo in the worst way this last recruiting cycle. So they know what he's capable of, and I think that they find themselves in a similar situation to what they were up against. Different offense, certainly, but what they were up against Washington. The only thing is that you don't have a Mikey Sainer still. So you hope that Zeke Berry playing that nickel, that he can maybe take up on Bond and be that quick guy, and then you put Will Johnson on Wingo, and then we'll see where they go from there. But they've passed those tests in the past with different defensive backs, but they're really going to need the help of their safeties, and obviously they're working in some new corners. You really like what you saw, I think, coming out of this first game with what Jair Hill, what he was able to do in his first start. So you're going to have to rely on him and Zeke Berry along with Will Johnson to be able to cover these guys, because they're going to try to spread the field. But at the same time, as Sharon Moore says, that Steve Sarkisian really does want to run the football. So it kind of starts with that, is being able to repeat kind of what they did this last week. Texas didn't look great running the football. They got 190 yards in this last game, but Michigan only allowed 9 to a Fresno State that just didn't shy away from it and just kept on trying and couldn't really penetrate that brick wall. So I think it starts with that to make them one-dimensional. And then I think that's when you can kind of, maybe if Wink Martindale can pin his ears back a little bit, then I think that's when that would come into play, is maybe you blitz on, if you can get them in a situation where they can't run the ball and they're in 3rd and long, and you're just trying to really force the pressures. But if Texas can get early success on start passing on 1st down, then I think all bets are off.
They really did benefit from those chunk plays on the ground in that first game for Texas. You are absolutely right about that. Like, that is something that I keep looking at, and I just think to myself, it really wasn't that impressive of a performance on the ground. So I'm really glad you said that, Isaiah.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, and that's if Michigan can take it away, which, I mean, by all accounts, I mean, I don't know that we look at Fresno State as being a prolific running offense. It's more of a passing offense, but they certainly never shied away from it, even though they only had one, maybe 2 successful runs. Otherwise, it was no gain, 1 yard, 2 yards, and they just kept going back to the well. I was actually impressed with how they tried to stick with it throughout the game, and even though it wasn't working. So if Michigan can hold up against Texas there, then I think we might be looking at a much longer game for the Longhorns than I think people thought.
James, I just have big picture questions if you have any more defensive questions.
Nope, I am good to go, buddy.
Isaiah, what's realistic expectations in a positive way with all the losses that took place with Michigan this offseason, with players going to the pros, coaches going to the pros, but also what's expectations in Ann Arbor for the national champions?
It's kind of mixed, I would say. I mean, Sharon Moore said at Big Ten Media Days, there's no honeymoon period. Like they want to win now. I know that a lot of fans will say like whatever happens this year is gravy because they won the national championship. I think that they want to believe that, but then you just kind of see the reaction of how things looked offensively, and people started going right back to the same well that they've gone for years of that's not going to beat Texas, that's not going to beat Ohio State, and we want this and we want this and we want this, right? So I as far as what I think Michigan's probably capable of, it is anywhere between 7-5 and 12-0. And I think it's going to put a lot of the pressure on the defense because they're just going to have to be unbelievably excellent every game as the offense continues to try to figure things out. That said, I mean, I talked to some staffers before the game, and they said like they were pleasantly surprised at how good the offense was in fall camp. So they might not be that far away from figuring it out. If they can translate it from the practice field to the games, then maybe it's better than it looked on Saturday. So it's kind of hard for me to say what the expectations are because a lot of people will still give lip service to the idea of Michigan won the championship last year. That's all we needed. Whatever happens this year is gravy. But you see the kind of consternation that comes out of a game like what we just saw, and suddenly it's like, oh no, you do care a little bit more. You want to be able to beat these big teams. There are certainly people who are panicking and trying to tell you they're not panicking, but they are very much panicking. And even with that said, like I think people shouldn't panic as long as they look good against Texas, even if they lose, because we've seen Texas loses to Alabama 2 years ago, and they still field a really good team. They didn't make it all the way to the playoff, but there was still a very solid Texas team. And then last year, Alabama loses to Texas and makes the playoff. So there's a lot riding on this game, certainly, but I think what's riding on this game more so is the narrative of what Michigan is. And certainly, if Michigan loses the game, like if it loses it in impressive fashion and not a good way for Michigan, then people are going to call Michigan dead, and it's going to be up to them to prove it. If they lose it in close fashion, might be the same, right? People might say, well, Michigan's dead because they just lost a regular season game for the first time since 2021. But in the grand scheme, especially with the 12-team playoff, I mean, if it was a 14 playoff, it would still be very much open for the Wolverines to get back into it. So I think the expectations more so have to come internally and taking it game by game, because USC didn't look like it was going to be an easy out. Not that I didn't think it was going to be. People were talking about that as an automatic win. I think that's going to be a tough game. Washington's going to be tough as your first road game. They're going to have some offense. Jed Fish wants to prove like, hey, we're taking things over, and it's not going to be a honeymoon period here either. And obviously, you get to the tail end of the schedule. Oregon struggled in week 1, but that's going to be a tough game. Obviously, they're my national championship pick personally, and then obviously Ohio State. So I think that ultimately, though, Michigan could go 6-6, and people will be very upset if unless it's one of those 6 is Ohio State, and then they'll be plenty happy, and they won't care that much.
I will say, Ken probably saw the smirk on my face when you mentioned when Alabama lost last season, because I kept pounding that to him. I was like, they lost early. That's when you want to lose, is that kind of game. So I loved hearing someone else say it. It was a very nice moment for me. But I will also say I have Texas winning the national championship just out of, an overflow of honesty here. My last question to you, Isaiah, is very simple. Michigan underdog in this game by roughly a touchdown, depending on what book you end up looking at. Do you see a scenario where Michigan wins this game, or are you going to pick Texas to win this one up in Ann Arbor?
I'd pick Texas, but there are certainly plenty of scenarios where Michigan can win. I think if Michigan plays the same type of game it played all the time the last 3 years, they certainly have that capability. It's just going to require the defense to do what it has done for 3 years, even though there's new faces, and the offense just to be able to move the ball down the field. somewhat methodically. They're going to have to do the way that they've done it. Get down to third, convert those third downs, and convert more touchdowns than you are field goals. I think that if they can be physical with Texas in a way that maybe Texas isn't expecting, which, I mean, they haven't played a team like Michigan, and that's where Michigan has really excelled, is because I don't think teams don't really understand what it takes to play Michigan, that old school football, because most teams don't play like that. Even when they have physical lines, it's different when it's both sides of the ball and they're mauling you. So I think the path for Michigan is obviously to have a much cleaner game on the offensive line and pretty much do what it was doing for the majority of the game against Fresno State defensively, as long as they don't start, bringing in guys early that we don't expect to see till the end of the season, or like in blowout situations, right? Like if we're starting to talk about names on the field that the average person hasn't heard of, and I should say average Michigan fan, like, because there's going to be players that maybe, y'all haven't heard of, that Michigan fans were like, oh, we've been waiting to see this guy. But if the average Michigan fan doesn't know, like, the guy that's in there in the second quarter and there's tinkering like that, then it might be a bit of a dicey situation. But I absolutely think they can win. I wouldn't predict it right now based off of what I saw in week 1, but that doesn't mean that they can't surprise. I harken back to my junior year at Michigan, and they opened up the season with like a 29-7 win or something like that over Vanderbilt. And I was in Las Vegas, and we're on the ride home, and my mom tells the cab driver on the way to the airport, says, "Oh, my son goes to Michigan." And he's like, "Oh, good football team." And I was like, "I don't know. I couldn't do anything against Vanderbilt." And well, I was like grumbling. The next week they go out and play Notre Dame, and it's like, oh my goodness, like they just absolutely curb stomped them. So I think that they've got that kind of team that could go either way. It's just a matter of confidence and in execution.
Isaiah Hull, you can see all of his great work covering the Wolverines for USA Today and Wolverines Wire, and he is the host of Locked On Wolverines. No co-host needed. Isaiah, thank you so much for giving us so much of your time today, man. We really appreciate it, and we're really looking forward to this game quite a bit. We had it circled on our calendars from day one of prepping for this season, and it is going to be awesome to see where Michigan is at right now as a program. This is going to be a really fun game to watch.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope it's a fun one to watch one way or the other.
Fingers crossed, man. Thank you so much again.
Thanks, Isaiah.
Yep, no problem.
All right, Ken, we've heard from our experts. Again, big thanks to Luke and Isaiah for joining us on the program today. We have to make our final 2 game picks. You and I have matched on 2 of the 3 picks so far. We've got 2 more to go. Ken, Colorado, Nebraska. Nebraska favored by 7.5 points in Lincoln. Who are you going with?
Definitely going with Nebraska. I have to. It's not even I have to see. Maybe sometime during the season they can gel, and I'm talking about the offensive line of Colorado. I don't see it happening in this game, particularly with the fact that now we know as far, and it's a small sample size, passing the ball. Nebraska can do that right now this season, looking at Dylan Raiola. And we all know, not historically, but mythically, who he's supposed to live up to or kind of be like. So I'm definitely going to lean with Nebraska in this situation.
Shootouts are never easy for an offense because there is so much pressure to score every time you go out on the field. And I do think that Nebraska's defense has it in them to limit Colorado to a degree. But I also think that just the sheer volume of explosive playmakers that Colorado has, that I do think they are going to keep this game close. I think that Nebraska wins, but I only think they win by a field goal. So I am going to go with Colorado in terms of the point spread on that game. So we do have 2 different. Go ahead, buddy.
I want to say this. At some point, the beating that Deion Sanders takes is going to not hurt him all along. I don't want anything to happen to that young man. I want him to go to the pros, have a great career, but it's going to prevent him from ending the game or playing in several games. So we know how many times they got to him last season. That's where my trepidation lies, James, where it could be a shootout if everyone is standing up right to the end of the game. I'm just worried perhaps that he may take a hit or two that may alter the offense for Colorado in this upcoming game.
I think that's a really astute point. I Still want to see a little bit more in terms of finishing plays, because I know that Colorado can still get the ball out quickly and kind of take advantage of some of their athleticism. Luke brought up some really good points about the way that Nebraska was able to really hurry up the UTEP offense. I think they can do that in a similar way to Colorado, but Colorado just has the athletes to really kind of make them pay for it if they can't get to Shedeur Sanders. And so I think that that's going to be a really big question, is going to be whether or not they'll be able to get that penetration and to get into the backfield quickly enough to disrupt these things. So, I mean, I think that you had a really good pick on that game. Like, I think that there's a big part of me that wanted to go with Nebraska to cover, but I'm not going to rule out Colorado completely. I think that this is a game. It feels like they're going to want to really bounce back from what they did last week and to really kind of make a statement this time around. So I think it's going to be a close game. So that one we will be different on. And then Texas, 6.5-point favorites over Michigan. I do have to say I have already put a little small wager on this game. I did pick Texas to cover. Ken Davis, who are you going with in this one?
Here goes my money added to yours. I'm taking the Longhorns.
All right.
I think this could be a game that builds upon what Michigan is doing this season, but I don't think when we're talking about Texas having a chance, and you said you have them winning it all, I believe in that. I mean, you're not picking them to be the best of the best when you have Oregon, Ohio State, and Georgia, and we don't know who Alabama is this year lingering out there in the ether. So when just that alone tells you, James, and you're not a simpleton, that Texas is that team. So for me, I'm taking Texas. I have to see it offensively from the Wolverines. And Texas, the thing is, Texas is I think Texas is going to get an upset loss this year. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's going to be this early. I would love to be wrong with it being a Big Ten school and the team that was a national champion last year, but I feel like all the lumps that Texas has kind of taken the last couple of years to keep them out of the national championship game, that they kind of figured it out this year, what all the key ingredients need to be within the recipe for them to go deep within the playoffs this season. So this point, I still have Texas being undefeated at 2-0 at the beginning of the year.
I like that pick a lot. I think, again, I did pick Texas to win the national championship. I just think they're a very complete team. I think that going through the gauntlet of the SEC, I do think they will pick up a loss at some point, whether that's to a team like Georgia or a team like Oklahoma, but they do have the neutral site game against Oklahoma. Georgia does come to Austin in the middle of October, so at least a lot of their tougher games are going to be at home. The game at the end of the season at Texas A&M, I think that one might be the trip-up point going into the SEC title game, just to throw out a little advanced prediction there. But, all right, Ken, we have talked a lot of football today. We've got a big weekend ahead of us. I am really looking forward to it. Can't wait to break it all down with you again on Sunday, man. Let's go get it.
Let's go get it. I look forward to a great show, James. A great guest, and Gary Gitz, Tony, and Claire. Everybody be safe. But let's get to it. It's the second week of the college football season, man. And it's going to be an interesting week here in Big Ten country.
Certainly is. Looking forward to breaking it all down on Sunday. Our thanks again to Luke and Isaiah and to Claire and Tony for booking everything and making us sound and look possibly better than we are. I can't speak for Ken because he is one handsome dude, but from my perspective, y'all make me look really good. So thank you so much, everybody, for listening to Big Ten Country. We'll talk to you guys this weekend.
Congrats, you finished the video. If you want to build on that success, download the NBC Sports Chicago app. It's got highlights, exclusive insights, and push alerts tailored to you. Everything you need to be a real Chicago sports fan. Download it now.